Hello, girls abducted by Savage Grace and long-neglected fan base. My name is Go Nilok, unless I'm misremembering, and I want to welcome you to my Heffy Metal Release of the Year showcase, conveniently finalized and distributed almost 10 full months after the year itself ended. I wasn't sure how I was going to go about this, and I wasn't sure if I was going to go about this, but clearly I did, and it has the same presentation as usual. I'll begin by rambling somewhat coherently through a curated list of my absolute favorite heavy metal offerings of 2021, and afterwards, I'll do the same with a list of dramatically inferior releases that I still loved and would recommend to the entire audience of this program. That's the format, and now I'll show you the content inside of it. Starting off, this is Apex Winter, which is probably when I should have released this video to begin with. Returning viewers of this channel might recognize by now that I'm an advocate for pretty much everything that the New Jersey-based collective NVNM puts out, and this is no exception. Frozen black metal ready to cook in just 12 minutes, presented in the same style as Death Fortress, and the bands that are similar to Death Fortress. Gargoyle won't cook as easily. Stone often has an inconveniently high melting point, I've found, but I still urge you all to hail to the Necro Doom with this spooky, occult-tinged doom metal record. Italy has always had a unique eeriness in their musical presentation, and that goes back to Death SS, but Gargoyle has the most in common with the equally talented and equally Italian Abysmal Grief. Modern Doom is a bit of a doozy, but there must have been some big fuck-off wooden crucifixes in the water because 2021 had a lot to offer, Exhibit B being Wheel. A blunt and bizarre band name that must have gotten preserved in time from the early 70s, but the music is more kindred with later-era Candlemass. Tight writing, evocative vocals, and a devotion to the integrity of classic Doom that many bands simply do not have anymore. And some bands don't have any integrity at all. Folks, this is Demiser, and it's not just you. There's an acrid stench of hangover vomit emanating off of the very JPEG of the album cover before you know. Black thrash with a rock and roll type attitude. I think you know what to expect from this one. You should at least, because I just told you. But if that's not evil enough for you, that's a weird complaint, but let's remedy that with the most literal solution possible. This is Evil, a Japanese black thrash band that's been kicking up quite a storm lately. Haha, it's funny that I wrote that down at one point like last year because they broke up a while ago by now. They have been on my radar since their 2019 split with Siege Column. There's that NVNM appreciation again. And when they followed it up with Possessed by Evil, they did not disappoint the side of my soul that cries out restlessly for broken English and solo-stricken blasphemy. It's 5 o'clock somewhere, ladies and gentlemen, the suffering hour. What better time to experience a cyclic reckoning? This is a beautiful and creative marriage of black and death metal, the kind compatible with all kinds of creative new angles. The first half of this record is fantastic enough, but it closes with a monstrous 16-minute track of truly ethereal tragedy. We often need to use the word art very loosely in this kind of subculture, but here we can screw it on as tight as it goes. Hopefully, you're not tired of suffering yet, because here comes a cruel reminder that you'll never own one of these tapes. Tales of Medusa broke over a decade of silence this year with their new demo, Antiquity. Spinning an authentic passion-over-fashion yarn of epic heavy metal, this band is the first thing that comes to mind when I hear the term artificial scarcity, going so far as to mail their most devoted friends and fans the only physical copies ever made of certain releases, and very intentionally foregoing the spotlight whenever possible. But it feels inappropriate to sing this tape's praises in frightened whispers when it hits such a melodically melancholic chord in my soul. I hope I'm not violating the project's sanctity by talking about them on a public platform, but if so, oops. That's enough romanticizing Antiquity anyway. I think pop history authors have that front covered a little too well. Let's snap back to the modern era. 1931 by Temple of Abraxas, a black metal project run by the same dude behind A Transylvanian Funeral. The man still loves his vampire folklore and still favors the more subdued, regal style of black metal that he won me over with on previous outings. Faratarium is kind of like that too, but not subdued at all. This is really wild and frantic melodic black metal from France, put out by the guitarist of Carne, it's French, who gives a shit, a band that also plays really wild and frantic melodic black metal in France, Weird, I wonder if they know each other. But this album is incredibly crafted, really not something you should skip if you care about black metal at all, and if you do, I sympathize. But let's relax with the humanization of black metal fans and take a look at some death metal for a bit, like the morbidly terrific Boys in Morbific, chunky and oozy, autopsy-inspired, putrid seeping of the ominous variety. If you know, you know, I guess. Old school death metal is coming out in droves these days, but for every 10 lazy late 90s worship projects, there's something like this, with songwriting and riffs so strong that it's all worthwhile. High praise, but we can go higher. Witch Vomit might be my favorite death metal band formed within the past decade. They've obviously got the aesthetic and the sensibilities of classic death metal, but also a unique enough character that I'm really struggling to think of anyone else that sounds exactly like them, old school or otherwise. I threw this on my album of the year list before I even listened to it. I was that confident, and fortunately they saved me any embarrassment, and it all worked out. Artificial Brain released a record in 2022, but while I stay in the 2021 mindset, the closest supplement was Charnel Grounds. Technical death metal has an iffy reputation, but I love this really unusual, tastefully progressive spin on it. Everyone else is playing with Gungan-style science fiction, but these dudes are on the System Shock sauce. If you don't play horror games from the previous century, just know that that is a compliment. Ceremonial Bloodbath's new demo is really just a preview of their upcoming full-length, but I didn't discover this band or their 2020 album in time for last year's list, so this is the perfect excuse to talk about them. Super tight and abrasive war metal, question mark? It's got pick slides, if nothing else. If you thought some of these previous picks have been underground, you're gonna think this next one is subterranean. Subterranean, ladies and gentlemen, it means under the ground. I really wish I featured more funeral doom on these lists, but I don't hear very much that's worth featuring, to be quite candid with you. Very happy to report that this Myriad of Eyes thing manages to stick the landing. Slow, spooky, it's got dripping noises in the background. It's truly the full package. Uh-oh, tempo change. Here comes gruesome stuff relish with a title that allots me my one token goo goo gaga. Kill, baby, grind. More horror movie worshipping death grind from some certified distributors of it. Once again, they seem largely hung up on the Italian stuff, and I can't blame them. I've been watching some bangers myself lately. The Red Queen kills 7 times, anyone? Mwah, molto bene. Not to mention all the Fulci and Diamato stuff. Those guys were really weird people. So was Aphrodite. That woman had some really questionable taste. The speed metal band that takes her namesake continues to impress me with their dedication to pure, bare bones, straightforward speed. There's flashy guitar and catchy choruses. That's really it. That's all you need. But I particularly love the vocalist's heavily accented English. It truly elevates this band to maniac mode. Unfortunately, this is the final release from the band, as they decided fairly that the Greek mythology theme can only take them so far. But 2 of the 3 members, everybody except the vocalist, are in a similar band called Devil Cross, which also had a pretty neat full-length album in 2021. If you like one, I would be shocked, disoriented, and betrayed if you didn't like the other. But after Maniac mode, it's now Brainiac mode, with the nerdiest band on the list, Blazin' Right. Soaring, fantasy-laced, epic heavy metal that, if I'm not mistaken, takes a lot of its sound from the earlier, less is more kind of bands like Mystic Force. Authenticity is super important with trad, but just a peek inside the endless halls of Golden Totem is enough to confirm that the nerdiness has seeped into their very souls. As is also observable in Oxygen Destroyer, an insanely tight death thrash band themed entirely around Godzilla and his assorted monstrous friends. I wouldn't even call this a gimmick. Looking at the people involved, their toys, their tapes, their t-shirts, and I feel that lifestyle might be a more appropriate word. The Grail uses words in their lyrics, and depending on the version you get, it's written in Enochian on the cover, which is pretty eye-catching. There's really thematically nothing unique in the slightest going on here, a goat head and a pentagram. But I don't know how they did it, man. That is a gorgeous cover. The music is a really bizarre, punk-minded take on black metal that confused me at first, but the off-kilter meeting of creepiness and playfulness quickly elevated this record to one of my most listened from 2021, and I was pretty late to the party, too. Phlegethon's Majesty is up there too, a Greek mythology-themed black metal project with a couple members from Crypts of Wallachia. They play it slow, they play it chill, they play it kinda spooky. It reminds me of some of the 90s German stuff like Ungod, but this band is Belgian. I've seen very little discussion and promotion related to these guys, but I vouch for both of their existing demos heavily. Leshy is such a bitch to track down because nobody ever seems to Latinize the name when they're talking about it online, so I gotta copy and paste it from my local files like a fucking maniac. Absolutely worth the convoluted and easily preventable frustration on my end, though this scratches a very particular itch for blown-out punky black metal. They belong to a regional black metal circle in Russia called the Pleskow Brethren. I know nothing about it, I've only heard 3 of the bands, but it's a promising rabbit hole waiting for you if you like this demo. Phrenolith, killer band. I'm always haunted by albums I didn't hear soon enough to include on my yearly lists, and maybe the earliest example that I can remember is Phrenolith's 2017 album. Having said that, Chimera's actually a little better, a humongous, moody death metal soundscape. I used to sell this band by mentioning that the Undergang guitarist is in it, but they've developed such a unique sound that it doesn't even matter anymore. Just another reason to keep up with those Danes, especially considering how fucking boring the United States scene has become. Now, as immediate and direct evidence to the contrary of what I just said, here is Funeral Chant. Named after a mortuary drape song, I assume, and not terribly inappropriately, they sound like that haunted, soupy bullshit from the late 80s like Necrovore and Possessed when nobody knew what genres were. Nobody knew what music was. They were just charging the fucking sigils and contesting the Church of the Priest, baby. Speaking of bullshit, whatever happened to Prescriptor McGovern's band Absu, and why he released an incredibly similar sounding follow-up project called Prescriptor McGovern's Abzu, I have no verifiable information, even though I've heard numerous plausible theories. Whatever the case may be, I fuck with it. It fits right in with the man's general absurdity and intensely verbose occult mysteries. Abzu is a staple of American extreme music, and if you lump Abzu in with that discography, you're pretty ridiculous if you don't. It's on the better side of the material. Insane drumming and vocal deliveries as always. It makes me so very happy to include Hordem Rife on this list. Their debut EP and Dommedagskevad are some of the best modern Norwegian black metal releases that I have heard. Modern meaning last decade or so. But their 2018 album, frankly, bored the fuck out of me. The writing was uninspired, and I kind of figured that the band burnt themselves out, but that's clearly not the case. Winds of Wrath has it all. Badass cover art, songs, abysmal grief. I literally name-checked these guys when talking about Gargoyle. That would have been a good transition. These guys are incredible. 6 albums of proper gothic doom in, and they've still got it. It could be the phrase cult of personality warping my mind, but there feels like a much stronger proto-metal, rock and roll angle being played on this record. And very quickly, a demo I was torn on including because it was technically recorded in 2001, but it's just too damn good. Wallakus with their demo B. Kind of an if you know situation, but it is well worth the effort to track it down if you have the means to do so. Badass and very awesome. Unlike the albums that will now follow in the second half of this video, they are so fucking bad they needed to be quarantined. No, they're all fantastic. You're all fantastic. I just recommend them with mildly less urgency. The First Days of Humanity, a goofy prehistoric-themed gore grind project that somehow managed to outdo Last Days of Humanity at their own game. Mostly because that record has some baffling and incredibly disappointing production handicaps, but no disrespect to the First Days, they're a lot of fun outside of the obvious comparison. Hanternose? This sounds like a fairy tale where the antagonist is a bowl of soup that doesn't have enough seasoning in it. There's a lot of character in the vocals that suggest a touch of madness, but it never really escapes. The record stays whimsical and it stays restrained. Still a great listen. Ungfell. This is like drunk hooligan black metal. These guys are constantly touted as a kosher alternative to, we're all adults here, Peste Noir, but they're so much more than that, especially when you consider that they're playing around with a pure and early sound that Peste Noir themselves abandoned very quickly. Only reason that this is in the second half of my video is that I feel Ungfell treaded this exact ground before, but the album remains fantastic. Antichrist Siege Machine is still killing the game, making black metal the way it's meant to be played, completely propelled by drumming with some big-ass impractical knife stabbed right into the amplifier. Disaster is killing a slightly different but related game, and they have been since the late 80s, always an impressive feat. Blistering black thrash with genuinely catchy riffs. Sometimes black thrash bands inherit a little too much from the thrash side, but that is not the case here. Inoculation is a strange pick for me. When I mentioned US death metal being boring, it shouldn't surprise you that I was alluding to Maggot Stomp and Friends. Nothing but wonderful people in my personal experience, but they produce music that does very little, if not nothing, for me. But Inoculation does not do nothing, they actually do something. A little sci-fi themed, chunky, techie death metal that sounds very modern, but more in line with something like Nucleus than any of Inoculation's label mates. Universally Estranged hits that same mark, weird but recognizably cosmic and interesting all throughout. A very immersive listen. Is that all I wrote? A very immersive listen? Okay, man. Festering Vampirism is, first of all, a disgusting visual. I'm imagining some chick's punctured throat trickling out a fiendish discharge. But discharge aside, it's also the name of a demo faithful to the US tradition of vampires standing at the crossroads of black metal and ambient music. I'm pretty much just talking about Black Funeral, but there you go. Winter Lantern is regrettably not a Bloodborne-themed project, even though that's the inspiration for the name. Bloodborne-themed black metal would be corny as fuck, but so are vampires, and they're corny in the most timeless and charming of ways. I have nothing nearly as flowery to say about Nikkei, Naki, well-mixed death grind, heavier on the grind, that never lets up, nor does it need to. There's a ton of great grindcore coming out these days, but the newer stuff really isn't distinct enough to make it to the top of my lists. To put it lightly, the genre as a whole is a human failure, crown on the head of a king of mud. A little heavy-handed with the genitive case, but this ambiguous conglomerate of D-beat and death metal and noise is so uncharacteristically toe-tapping that when you hear the record, you're gonna wish you had it in your personal collection. Oh, good lord, I think that is probably pronounced Hadith, but I could not find an answer one way or the other. This album is wild. It definitely flirts with war metal, or more generally, a marriage of every extreme metal sound, but the record is way too dense and creative for me to summarize it that easily. It's on Sentient Ruin. If you're familiar, that alone should give you some idea of what you're in for. Crazy Bones. Mocha has a similar vibe that's thankfully much easier to describe. Swirly black death that flirts with dissonance. I wouldn't call it dissonant, but if somebody did call it dissonant, I would not scowl, nor would my jaw drop. Really interesting sound. If this is representative of a greater Croatian sound, I have no goddamn idea, but it's fantastic. Gnosis returns to my channel because I'm still a sucker for the classic Hellenic sound. Rotting Christ and friends have long since abandoned their ancient ways, so I'm very happy it's still howling out from somewhere. In this case, the misty mountaintops of Miami, Florida. It's not entirely fair to say that classic Greek bands have changed irreversibly. If I can break your immersion for a moment and remind you that we're well into 2022, Thou Art Lord just had a new EP. That was great, but it's still nice to hear a familiar sound channeled through a young, fresh, creative conduit. Oh God in heaven, that reminds me that Necromantia, one of the finest Mediterranean motherfuckers to ever do it, kinda came out of nowhere and dropped their first album in like 15 years. It is unfortunately something of a memorial for the recently deceased bassist Baron Blood and marks the end of the band entirely, and that being the case, of course, we don't have Baron Blood's distinct bass tone that kinda makes Necromantia what it is, but sentimentality aside, I'm really shocked that this album is as good as it is. And for the grand finale, if you are steel-bearing with me, I'd like you to meet Steel-Bearing Hand. Thrash metal maniacs at heart with the technicality and the sensibility to increase the probability of my own enjoyment of their work by lacing every track with some delectable black and death metal. It's a style with a low bar for entry, but pulling off a worthwhile thrash track that runs over 12 minutes is borderline unthinkable. These queens can slay in my hell any day. But the same does not go for the rest of you. I'm frankly very tired of you, and I'd imagine the feeling is mutual by now. I will include links in the description of this video wherever applicable. I'll post a chart of all these albums on my Facebook and Instagram pages, which will also be linked below. And even though you're a rugged bunch, I'm legitimately curious to hear what you think about these selections and about any other albums that made your own personal lists. You all take care now.